You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Today is November 5th, 2020, and I have a great privilege to be here talking with Emily Chamlee-Wright. Emily, I'm thrilled to be here with you. So thanks for agreeing to do this. As you know, the context is that we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Mercatus Center, and both you and I were products of the sort of, I guess, first generation of Mercatus students or whatever. So anyway, thanks.
It's absolutely my delight to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So, you know, we've discussed this personally at times. I mean, you yourself were the person that had great interest in the arts and whatnot, and you ended up by becoming a professional economist. I don't know if you know this, but Roy Cordato and Karen Palasek both were graduates of Hart School of Music. It's a music conservatory, and they were going to be in music, and then they became economists. So that's kind of a strange thing. Can you tell us a little bit about your own origin story, how you got interested and see these things connected in some sense in your interest?
Yeah, and it's really a Mason story in so many ways because I grew up in the Northern Virginia area, so Mason was kind of my backyard. And I looked for arts programs around the country that I was interested in. And what it really boiled down to is what I wanted to do was I knew that I didn't have the native talent to be a professional performing artist. And it was something that I loved, but I was already 18 and I just knew that if someone was going to be offering me a contract, it would have happened by then. So I was really practical and said, well, what could I do? I could imagine a career in arts administration, for example, something that would keep me close into it. So it seemed to me an eminently practical thing to do was to get a business degree and then continue on with my arts community activity that I had already developed in the Washington, D.C. area. And Mason would allow me to do that, right? So I went to Mason as a business major or intent upon a business major, and then doing some things in the arts, but really mostly keeping my ties with the arts community, the dance community in particular in the DC area. And then so as part of the business major, I took introductory econ, which just scared the bejesus out of me because, we had Jim Bennett, who was, Jim does not start his freshman classes in economics with a kind of soothing bedside manner kind of approach, right? He's like, this is going to be a really tough class. If you're not accustomed to a college level class, look to your left, look to your right. One of you isn't going to be here by the end, kind of that sort of story. So I was terrified. And so I worked really hard. And it turned out that in working really hard, I kind of liked it. And the sort of the economic way of thinking became super and appealing to me, and it answered a lot of questions I had. And so I went to my advisor in the business department and said, well, great. After I did the first couple of econ classes, I said, when do I get to take my next econ class? And they said, no, you're done. You're good. It's all finance and accounting from here. And I'm like, well, that sounds boring, So I thought about it, and I went to my father for advice. And I said, I'm thinking about economics as a degree instead of business. And he said, economics is a completely useless degree. But if that's what you want to do, that's what you should do, because you'll find it interesting, and it'll be, the kind of thing that you should do in college is to, follow your passion. So that was pretty cool of my dad to just kind of go, it probably makes no practical sense, but go for it. And so from there, I started just taking, the intermediate classes, and that, kind of connected me to people like Karen Vaughn and Don Boudreau. And then I started getting more and more into the upper level stuff, which was the Austrian courses and the comparative systems courses and the political economy courses. And that's really where the traction came that, oh, this is more than just something that's interesting to me. This is something that really is exciting me at a deeper level, and kind of want to be a part of it going forward somehow. So that's how it started.
That's a great story. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but one time I was crossing the border from the United States and Canada, and the Canadian customs official, when he was looking at my passport, asked me, "What are you going here for?" And I said, "I'm going here for an economics conference." And he said, "When you were a little kid, did you ever imagine you'd grow up to be an economist?" And I said, "No, I thought I'd grow up and play shortstop for the New York Yankees." And he handed my passport back, and he says, "Don't give up on the dream." So very few of us ever think that we're going to go into economics or whatever, right? But it is amazing this, and especially as you talk about there, the kind of economics that people were teaching, Bennett or other people that taught principles of economics at that time, which would have included also Walter Williams, and also the context of the time. They made economics come alive so much that you could explain and understand the world. But you mentioned these advanced classes, and I guess I want to get at the question, which is our biggest common ground, which is, what's your first impression when you met Don Lavoie for the first time?
So that was in the comparative economic systems class, and I was a junior at the time. And the first impression were like his early lectures in comparative economic systems. And you know what those lectures are, right? He starts out by saying, look, it's really important whether or not the money supply grows by 3% a year or 3.2% a year. That can make a big difference. But that's not the kind of question we're going to be asking in this class. We're going to be asking questions like, should we have property rights or not? Okay. And so those sort of fundamental big questions, what is the source of wealth creation? Where does the astonishing degree of social coordination that we see in a market, how does that come about? Are there other ways to coordinate society, and what do they look like, and what are the trade-offs with alternative forms of social coordination? Those are the big questions that really animated the discipline for me, and that was a big part of it, is that he was willing to ask the big questions. But as we got into the course, he said, he would, especially as we entered into the segment on fascism as an economic system, he asked the question, how is it that one of the most sophisticated societies in the world, a society that generated the most beautiful music, some of the most important philosophical advancements, comes from a society that then systematically murders 6 million of its own people? Yeah. And then what does economic policy have to do with that outcome? Yeah. It's your duty, if you're an economics student, if you're a student of this discipline, it's your duty to understand that connection. And I still get the hairs on the back of my arm just like rise up every time I think about that moment, because that was the moment, I brought that back home that night, and I didn't sleep. I literally stayed up all night, and I was thinking, oh yeah, that's what I want to do. That's, I want to do that. I want to do what he does, and I want to be as good at it as he is. And then within the next beat, there I am, like sitting up in the middle of the night, just kind of thinking it all through. And then I was like, oh crap, that means I have to get a PhD in economics. That was not part of the plan, And so but I remember that night as being a pivotal night where it was like, okay, I guess this is what we're going to be doing. And so that really was the plan. So it was in that first encounter, that first course with Don. He was willing to ask the big questions. And another thing he was willing to do is to say, it was very clear he was a pro-market kind of economist, but he was the real deal in terms of a scholar who understood the appeal of Marxism. And he would say, if you don't understand the appeal of Marxism, you don't understand the 20th century.
Right.
And so really taking seriously the moral and philosophical commitments of Marxism so that you could understand its appeal rather than, find the easiest way to take the cheapest shot was also what made an impression on me. And that those themes have stayed with me forever.
Yeah, I really, one of the biggest costs of the timing of technology and stuff to me is that we don't have a record of we don't have much of a video record of Don as a teacher. And I think this is a huge thing because in my impression, when I think about that, I think this is the boldest yet most sophisticatedly compassionate teacher I've ever encountered. And I've encountered bold teachers before, but they didn't necessarily weren't compassionate. They were more like, look to the right, look to the left, you're going to get out of here, right? And also a moral purpose to the life, the being able to get to the root of these problems in society that Don communicated and conveyed to you. And it's interesting to me, like when I see him, like there's a video of him giving a lecture at Mason on Marxism and central planning or whatever. And, I use it, I give it to my students to watch and everything like that. And it's very thorough and it's all those things like that, but it doesn't yet kind of communicate this impression that I always had of why it is that I wanted to sit in the very front row. Most of my education, right, I sat in the back row and, there's a few professors, I moved all the way to the front row and I wrote down everything that they were, doing. And Don was one of them. And it's a very, very unique sort of environment. He was unashamedly radical in the intellectual sense, like get to the root cause of the issue. I guess that I also wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about the Center for Study of Market Processes, which was the predecessor of the Mercatus Center or the earlier manifestation of the Mercatus Center, because you have a unique window into it because of getting excited about these ideas as an undergraduate and then, getting Don into Don's orbit as an undergraduate and then continuing through your PhD. Which is different from, other people who went somewhere else and then came there or whatever. And so give us a little bit about that perspective that you have from your different windows, like CSMP as an undergraduate, then as a graduate, and then as an alumnus.
Yes. So one of it helps to paint the picture, right? The picture I'm going to paint, it's like, Robinson Hall, an unadorned classroom building. It had pretty much zero sex appeal to it. Yeah. And I don't even think Robinson as we remember it, I don't think even it exists anymore, does it?
Well, it's getting leveled and rebuilt.
It's getting leveled.
But in the middle of COVID, so I have no idea what I've seen.
So by the time this thing airs, it probably won't be around anymore. But it was just the Mercatus, or the Center for the Study of Market Processes, was essentially an office at the end of a long hallway that had one proper office, a sort of tiny little reception area, and then one awkwardly long and narrow conference room, essentially. Right. And that was it. That was the center. And so as an undergrad, my encounter with it, by this time I had taken an Austrian course. I was, really kind of marching down the path of Hayekian social theory, as well as a sort of, economic perspective. and I wanted to be a part of anything that Don was a part of. Right. So I crashed graduate student readings groups. No one told me that I was actually invited. I just decided that I was. Now maybe someone might have suggested, oh yeah, we gather. It's like, great, what time? So I crashed, and I had like literally no business being there in terms of my level of preparation and reading. But the graduate students who were there, Don was awesome. And the graduate students who were there were, just really, I look back at it now, and they're just, you all were so sweet, right? You were just like, you chief among them would like look over your shoulder and you're like, who's this? Right? Oh, okay, cool. Bring her into the room. Right. And so you guys put up with me and were patient, and those early experiences of being treated like your ideas matter. That's so profound for someone who enters into a space and doesn't necessarily think that she has a scholarly persona. Having other people willing to allow you into it, even though it's in some sense, you're kind of faking it until you make it. Other people being willing to uphold that polite fiction is really helpful in a young scholar's career, because it meant that I could start to take my own thinking seriously. So that little tiny conference room at the end of the hallway was a whole universe that opened up because people were intellectually hospitable.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think part of that is that we were all told that we didn't belong, which is part of the issue. So we were all like kind of had a chip on our shoulder at some level, but at the other level, Don told us we weren't allowed to be bitter and have a chip on the shoulder. So instead it was all like a different kind of idea. And there was a real sense of community that was formed in this little tiny thing, including Colleen Moretta. And, every little bit and piece of the different folks were important, I think. In an earlier part of the center, which is before your time, and they didn't keep doing it, they actually used to hire, they had an editor that's sole purpose was to help graduate students learn how to write. It was amazing, actually. That
when you think about it.
That existed for my first year, the summer after my first year, summer after my second year. And then they moved on. And part of it is that the first year was devoted to learning how to write scholarly journal articles. And the second one was learning how to write op-eds. And people weren't as interested in writing op-eds and policy papers, except for someone like Jerry Ellig or whatever, right? And then they specialized in that. But most of us were interested in that first year. But that very first year, Don was the one who was so excited, and they had this professional editor, and they worked with us to try to, and that's, this, I mean, this is the downside of Don, which is that he had those pens in his pocket, and you would hand him your draft of your paper, and your paper had less white space and black on it than it had red and green and all that other stuff all over it. And you learned he was an exacting, as much as he was inviting, he was exacting in your expression of things. And so anyway, it was an amazing environment that they created around Jack High and Don. And at that time, it would have been George Selgin, I guess, and Don Boudreau as well, right?
Exactly. And Karen. Yep.
Yeah. And Victor Vanberg was pretty much always at the Public Choice Center by the time you were, because when I started, he was in the center with us, and then he moved to the Public Choice Center, I think.
Yeah, so he wasn't typically found in that space, but then a lot of the more Austrian bent grad students, like I did, took his institutions course,
right?
And that was really valuable.
Yeah, and was Jennifer Roback teaching at Mason when you were?
Yes, she was. She taught in the micro sequence when I started out in the first year sequence. She taught part of the micro sequence.
And Mike Alexiev taught math econ.
Yeah, Mike then taught the math econ course, and he taught the Soviet systems course.
Soviet systems course, yeah. And did you have, like, in your undergraduate sequences, did the market, like, did Jack High teach intermediate micro, or did you or was that Boudreaux or somebody, or?
So by the time I was a senior, I like finished all the undergraduate econ courses, and I started taking some graduate courses. And so I took a course, a version of the Austrian course at the graduate level with Jack in my senior year, and which was perfect because you really changed it up. I think that I took a similar course with a similar title later, but it was a very different course by the time I took it as a graduate student. Just the focus in the second iteration was much more on research and writing, much heavier. And so it was a very different course and a very different experience for me. So I got to dip my toes in the water in grad courses, and actually like the fun grad courses. I didn't, as a senior in college, or I was taking the sort of second year classes of graduate work, not the hard stuff, not the spinach, not the spinach of the micro and the macro and of the first year courses. And so it was a little bit of a rude awakening to move from kind of, this undergrad where everybody had kind of embraced me and was, I felt like I was being treated as a graduate student and a full-fledged, member of the community. And then I became a first year graduate student, and I got the full treatment of what it feels like to be a first year graduate student, which is like, don't talk to me until you finish your prelims, right? Don't talk to me until you have successfully covered the hurdle, surmounted the hurdle of the first year. Then we can, get you back into Austrian stuff and comparative system stuff. And so it was very much, I got put back into that sort of like boot camp mentality as a first year graduate student, which was a very cold, bracing shower, but it was good for me.
And to be honest with you, I do think that the sequence at Mason in that time was a very rigorous. It was a very rigorous presentation of neoclassical economics. Mike Alexiev was teaching us general equilibrium theory and welfare economics. And in the first class, we were learning Chicago price theory, like to the nth degree, right? It was all optimization and equilibrium models. Yep. And so macro was ironically, macro was where you had some breathing room, because Don taught the second macro course. At least when I was going through, Don taught second macro, and it was all Leyenhofen and UCLA coordination, Keynesianism. The first one was all ISLM and rational expectation stuff and everything like that. And so it was dreadful. And we did that, but it wasn't pretty. I feel very fortunate the education that we got at that time at the school, and I think the teachers. I wanted to mention one more thing before I go on, which is the one thing I think is unique about the center was, you would have come in when they were just getting tenure, probably. But like when I started graduate school, which is just a few years before you, they were all assistant professors, and they really were dedicated to teaching. So Jack, who wasn't the same kind of teacher as Don, but nevertheless, he was very, very thorough, right? His syllabus and the way he walked through. So even when he did Austrian economics, it was like, it was, like right down the line. And so it was a great course to take from him, because you really just learn, in sort of straightforward way, the main propositions of the Austrian.
Yeah. He didn't indulge his favorite margin of Austrian thinking. He said, look, I've got to induct these young scholars into a tradition. And so it's my job to induct them properly. And I can't do that if I spend all the time focusing on the things that are, tickling the back of my brain. Right. As an Austrian, that doesn't really introduce them to the body of thought. So he really took that, at least as demonstrated by the course itself. It seems to me that he really took that responsibility seriously.
Right. Yeah, they were a good team, Don and
they were.
And Jack, in the sense that Jack really gave you that thorough step by step, cover the whole material survey. And then Don was, where are the cutting edge issues?
Diving into hermeneutics and hypertext.
Yeah. I mean, so it was an unusual thing because it was all based in Mises for Don, but then it was like, where can I go with these ideas rather than where I've been with them, kind of idea.
But that was another reason why those readings groups were so important. We read big chunks of human action in a readings group. Yeah.
I mean, that actually was Jack, from what I understand historically, is that Jack was a visiting PhD student at NYU, and he was doing his PhD at UCLA, but then he had a chance to come and do NYU is a different kind of beast. And so Jack wasn't able to he could get standard neoclassical economics out at UCLA. So he wanted to come and he wanted to study with Lockman and Kerzner, but he wanted to get more Austrian economics. And so he started a reading group, and that reading group included Don, but also Ebeling and a bunch of other people that you all know their names around. And they read every page of Human Action, all the way through, and had these debates and discussions about where it's going in his relationship. And so as a result, Don became convinced that reading groups were this amazing way to learn. And then, there was never a semester where Don wasn't directing a reading group. It was amazing, right?
Exactly.
And if you didn't do the reading, and by the way, the reading didn't dovetail with what you were taking in classes. So if you didn't do the reading.
Yeah, it was that's the only way that you got to be a part of the conversation. No, we went through, I remember going through Human Action and Theory of Money and Credit. But I also remember whole semesters where we were diving into Habermas.
Yes. Yeah. Amazing.
Like talk about sort of like highly impractical if what your goal is to optimize your results on the, prelims and field exams, right? But it was this challenge to take a voice on the left really seriously. And that also epitomized Don.
Yeah, it was. Later on, it was Frederick Jamison and other kinds of people, which is like some semesters it'd be bizarre as hell. But it's funny that you mentioned Habermas, because I tell this story to everyone. In our third year graduate school, Dave Perchicko and I said, we all of a sudden we realized that we have to get a job at the end of this. So we go and talk to Don and we say, Don, how the hell do you get a job, at the end of this? And Don, of course, says to us, I don't know.
I don't know. I didn't know that was part of my responsibilities is to worry about that.
I do this. So then we started randomly applying to different places. And it was at a time when heterodox economics was starting to get around. So this little college in New York, Hobart and William Smith colleges, had this position for a heterodox economist. And Perchicko and I made their list to be interviewed, even though we were not even ABD, I don't think, at the moment.
Wow.
But anyway, so we get invited to the Eastern meetings to go and interview with them, and I forget which one of us, one went at this time, the other one went another time. And then we were going to meet up for dinner and talk about how our interviews went. And so we sit down and we say, well, how'd the interview go? And we both are like, it was awesome. They loved what we had to say. It was great. Well, what did you say? They said, I would design a course on the Hayek and Habermas debate. And then I'm like, that's funny, Dave. I said the same thing. And so, they must have thought what the hell are these clowns, doing, right? So we didn't get the job, by the way, but that was
But that also begs the question, who was at Hobart and William Smith that got that job ad passed through?
Yes, unbelievable. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a story there.
Fascinating. Anyway,
there's a story there for sure.
But that was all from Don, getting us. And I remember even when I was doing my dissertation, which was on the Soviet experience, and I was reading a lot of different people, Maurice Daub and others, V.H. Carr and whatnot, and a lot of various different. Don always demanded that you have the most charitable reading of the people that you're arguing with.
Exactly.
Even in that, just like what you said before about with the fascism ideas, is how can a civilization which is responsible for such great beauty be responsible for such great inhumanity, right? Mm-hmm. And so you can't just dismiss it by saying, they're all horrible people or whatever.
They're all Nazis by their DNA.
Yeah.
And that doesn't work. Yeah, it's not intellectually honest. And also it doesn't help us really understand, more to the point, is that no layperson figures that economics has anything to do with 6 million Jews being systematically murdered. He was connecting those dots for us and seeing those connections between nationalist economic policy and the kind of horrors that came in their wake. And so that connection was what was that connection, that system was what was animating him and helping us to become better economists.
Yeah, no, yeah. So let's turn to your own chosen field of research, and that was in the field of development economics with a focus on context, both historical and institutional, and the role of the entrepreneur. Tell us a little bit about that project, dissertation, your subsequent work, your time that you spent in Africa, these kind of things.
Sure. Let me back up just one step, which was the first paper that I wrote that I would count as like a deep dive research paper, and I did it as an independent study. I think it was underdone, and I honestly don't remember. I think it was as an early graduate student, and it was on Quaker business history. And so I was interested in Quakerism in my personal life, but this business history of Quakers having success in a mercantile, merchant-based set of business practices, and really standing out for their practices, that their moral and religious commitments constrained them in some ways, but it also then ended up giving them a comparative advantage. And so the old saying is, the Quakers came to America to do good, and they wound up doing very well, meaning that they were actually commercially successful. And so I was really interested in understanding the network effects and the ideological commitments of Quaker business. And so that really set me up to be interested in this confluence of culture and economics. Culture was so often portrayed as the sort of thing that kept us from being homo economicus, the thing that kept us from being efficient, that if it weren't for cultural constraints, we could have widespread prosperity and development. And I was really seeing it in a different way, that people interpret their environment and their possibilities for economic progress through a cultural lens. And yeah, that cultural lens may confine our activities, like it did for Quaker business people. They couldn't engage in munitions production because of their peace testimony. But they started really going down, do it using ironworks for pots and pans and refining processes, so that it became much more efficient, so that everyday utensils and materials could become affordable. And so it was an expanse of the market kind of story that became an opportunity because of a cultural constraint elsewhere. And so there are lots of examples like this for Quaker merchants who became, in essence, captains of industry. And so that was a fascinating story to me. I set that project aside, and then I was interested in economic development. I was really I was enamored with the economic way of thinking, but also excited by the fact that wherever markets seem to thrive, human flourishing also seemed to thrive. And so I wanted to get at those kinds of questions in a developing world context. So I went to Ghana and I started looking around for projects that were probably kind of straight up political economy projects in a kind of P.T. Bauer-like way. What are the institutional political impediments to economic growth? marketing board structures that tried to control competition and commodities, things like that, and how it was all just a recipe for crony capitalism. I went in with that lens, that political economy lens, and I landed in Accra, and I go to the first informal market, which is if you want to eat, that's what you've got to do just to, be in the place. And I saw the sea of women dominating this local informal marketplace. And this was no joke. This was not, just a row of women here or there. This was a deeply complex network of an informal market. And as far as the eye could see, women after women after women in stall after stall after stall in a place that was so confusing and maze-like that you could very, very easily get lost. And I was hooked. I mean, it was like a religious experience, for an economist to see market so fully on display, and also see fully on display. I was aware that this was still, a socially conservative environment with respect to attitudes on gender equity. And here were women dominating this market context. And I was hooked. I was like, that's what I want to write about. That's what I want to get at. How does this work? What are the rules? What are the rules of this environment that led to this, and how do they operate in this environment? And so once I just had to see it before it became visceral. But once I did, I really, the political economy story was still there, but it was in the background. What I really wanted to elevate was the intersection between the cultural systems and the economic systems.
Yeah. Well, that work is just fantastic. I want to ask you a couple more questions about that, but I first want to just get back to the intellectual environment at Mason at the time, because it's a unique environment for studying economics and encouraging these kind of questions. And it wasn't just Don. Don, well, first of all, did you get a chance to study at all with Kenneth Boulding, or was that?
He was in he didn't teach courses, as I recall, right? He was sort of like a guest, a kind of visiting scholar, right? So I would go to some of his talks, but that was when I was an undergrad.
Right. Okay.
And so I didn't quite know who this figure was. I knew he was important, but I had no sense of his place in the intellectual history of economics. I encountered him at meeting a couple of times, because he would visit meeting, and I knew that he was living on campus, and so he was just kind of an enigma that I wondered at, but I didn't have. It's a perfect example of how becoming a scholar is a process of becoming enculturated in a community, and I was still an outsider in the sense, not that I was being treated unfairly or anything like that. It was a matter of, it just takes time and kind of proximity to kind of absorb the cultural norms of the community's narrative of itself. And so how a figure like he would fit in with the Austrian community and with other scholars, and his wife, Elise Boulding, how she was fitting into that milieu as well. It was happening, outside of my sphere of awareness and consciousness at that point. I could just barely scratch at it.
I was wondering, because of the Quaker connection, that, when he passed away, I think schools like Swarthmore and other places that have strong Quaker heritage, maybe it's Haverford. I can't remember the one.
I think it's Haverford.
Haverford or whatever. They had these celebrations, however Quakers do that for, a week.
Quietly.
Quietly. Yeah. So, okay. So that's one, but also then how about McCloskey and Clommer? Are they in your business coming through?
Yes. So they were also coming through, and they were part of, there were a couple of things. They were part of, I think, some job talks at various points, and again, talk about another thing that is somewhat of an opaque thing to peer into when you're certainly an undergrad or first year graduate student. But they were also part of a series that Don was a part of, which was called Interdisciplinary Trespassing.
Yeah.
And it was a series of lectures and it would feature scholars who were excited about kind of blurring the disciplinary lines and not going in actually as in a way that would seem like as imperialists, right? Trying to just kind of dominate. I'm gonna pack your very nuanced intellectual program into my cost benefit analysis. That's one version of interdisciplinary trespassing. And that was definitely not the spirit of this series. It was much more like, I'm going to really take your project from your discipline seriously and then think it through about what challenges it has for my project, say in economics, and how it challenges economics to think differently about itself because of that challenge. So that was definitely the spirit. So Clommer came in under that, McCloskey came in with that series. And what was helpful too is because it was, that series was truly an invitation across the campus. And so I think that people had been prepped to avoid the jargon, the rarefied jargon of the discipline, so that we could bring in people into the conversation across disciplines. And that was perfect for early graduate students, higher level undergrads who are willing to kind of think it through, to gain a foothold in the discipline, because you started to see its relevance. So those were really valuable contributions.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because Don himself is kind of making a transition from economics proper to social theory, and this interdisciplinary philosophy, history, politics is all part of the, his agenda that he's doing. He's sharing that with everyone because he's so enthusiastic about what opens up if you have economics as sort of your economic way of thinking, as you put it, as this groundwork, but then you're opening up to all these other vistas that are opened by these other disciplines. And that was one of the things Don was going through, I think. And so it was really fascinating to have all these people coming in, and he was very entrepreneurial in reaching out to bringing in McCloskey or bringing in a Clommer and seeing this kind of overlap between the concerns that they had about rhetoric and whatnot, and then, other kinds of people doing history. So we remember at this time, Jack is really into business history, right? Mm-hmm. So, that and all those things are going on. One last thing about this intellectual environment is that Buchanan had already won the Nobel Prize. So he's not on campus as much as a normal faculty member would be, but there's also enough distance that maybe that the invites are declining a little bit. So does he come back into the teaching fold for you, or is he not teaching at that time?
He is, and he isn't for me because I'm focusing in on the comparative systems stuff and the Austrian stuff. But definitely, he's still for those students who are the public choice students. He's definitely a part of a important presence, just like Tulloch, in the students who were funded through the Public Choice Center. So there was. So that was, I think, it was not anything like a schism, but it was definitely a difference in emphasis.
But you're getting that Hayek-Buchanan blend through Vanberg.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So yeah. Okay. And then is Karen Vaughn back? Is she the department chair, or is she back in the classroom?
She is definitely in the classroom by the time I'm a graduate student, because I'm taking courses with her, which is very much a kind of early writers workshop course. I honestly don't remember the topic, but it was about essentially Austrian/political economy, right, but with a focus on writing, where it's a small group. So she's really helping to develop the writers, the graduate students as writers, in that period of time. So I think by that time she had stepped down as chair, but it's all fuzzy. It's all fuzzy as to who was actually in the administration, which is in some ways like awesome. Like graduate students shouldn't be paying attention to who's chair, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like stay out of the academic politics as long as you
Right.
can, because it'll come to your door soon enough.
Yeah, yeah.
And I do remember being somewhat oblivious to some of the political machinations within, campus
That were going on.
politics.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
The
almost to
thing,
the point where it was like a willful ignorance.
yeah, the thing about Karen, which is often not appreciated enough, is actually how clear a writer she is.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
so if you read essays of hers, like, does it matter if costs are subjective? She's dealing with a very fuzzy topic, but she makes it seem very clear. And her own contribution to socialist calculation debate is a very clear, straightforward thing. So she actually had the ability to write about very complicated issues in a very clear manner. And so learning from her, I think, was really important. Anyway, the reason why I asked you about all that is because this is kind of all the mix that's going on, and then you're off trying to now write on development economics. You're bringing the theories of entrepreneurship to bear on a cultural understanding of the rules of the game and informal enforcement mechanisms, and with a focus on actually a gender kind of what's the right way to put it, a kind of unusual power in a powerless situation, or voice is being given to people that normally don't have voice, but the mechanism isn't through politics, but through markets. So could you explain a little bit more about not only what you saw when you were there, but how then you develop this argument and it becomes such a major part of what you're talking about with regard to development economics?
Yeah, so the backdrop is, in this context, is that at the time, the main narrative within development economics and sort of global economics is that capitalism oppresses people of the global South. Capitalism and markets are the source of control and oppression, particularly of women. And it's like you go to the informal marketplace of a place like Accra, Ghana, and you go, oh no, this is exactly what you said, only exactly the opposite, right? I mean, it was such an easy grab in some sense. It was low hanging fruit intellectually to say that it's way more interesting than you've just described. That yes, women are of a marginalized status in many ways within this context, and they are deploying market mechanisms in such a way so that they can maintain control over their own resources, that they are responsible for the care and feeding of their kids and essentially the school fees, the education of their kids. And they have had to have a way of maintaining control over their resources to do that. So then things like the rotating credit associations that they developed were a perfect mechanism that kept their earnings from the day out of the hands of their husbands, out of the hands of their brothers and their fathers. When they would go home at night, they kept it within the security of an informally designed rotating credit association. It's brilliant, right? It allows them to accumulate. It also allows them security and safety of their resources when formal mechanisms like formal banking mechanisms just were not set up for them, right? It was way too complicated. And this was really just before like micro lending foundations and things like that are taking off. The Grameen Bank is on the scene, but it hasn't like taken hold as the panacea. And even after it starts to take root, still women are saying that particular variation is something that is pocked with flaws in my cultural context for some reason or another. And so they're always devising alternatives to whatever formal system is offered to them.
Yeah, it's a
And
fascinating bottom.
That agency is what excited me more than anything else, is that yes, there are structures in place, social structures in place that inhibit women from advancing, and also women are exercising agency at kind of like a hyper degree of agency that you can't ignore if you want to really understand what's going on here.
Yeah, I think, Emily, I mean, I think that the point you made about the Grameen Bank and the timing is very important here, because that became then later on a kind of a policy of choice of a lot of experts from afar, whereas what you're actually seeing is a true bottom-up solution that happened before the experts. So the genius of the system is that it's bottom-up in the solving the problem that the people in that context had. Anyway, that work of yours is embedded in your book is just awesome. So, and it really is a window into the developmental process in the right sort of way that gives weight to all of that bottom up kind of energy that's associated with that. Bill Easterly recently had a post, and he said that we should listen to all the development experts, the 7 billion of them, right? And this is actually what I think about when I read your work about that. Is that's exactly right. This is not saying that you can't do anything and improve or whatever, but it's really the unleashing of the agency, as you said, of the people, and you give such weight to that. And you were there, right? Which gives weight to like your argument as well. So it's not like you're just staring at a computer and running regressions.
And I wouldn't have, had I not been there, I would not have seen the relevant things that mattered.
Yeah.
I would not have picked up on both the constraints and the solutions to those constraints had I not. Now maybe someone who's just smarter than me can do that, but I'm not that smart. I need to like see it. Yeah. And so like having boots on the ground is the way in for me to see the things that are interesting.
I want to come back to that when we talk about your next project, but I want to step back because I don't want to lose sight of the fact that you left the program at Mason after getting your PhD, and you ended up by being a teacher at an outstanding liberal arts college. One might say one of the Midwest elite colleges, right, of liberal arts. You were probably one of, I don't know, less than a handful of people that thought that markets were a good thing in that environment of that school. Maybe I'm overstating that case.
No, it's like I had a couple of colleagues in the economics department who agreed with me on that, and that was just about it.
Yeah, but you had to interact, and you devoted a good part of your first half of your career really to being an outstanding liberal arts teacher and a passionate teacher. I can remember, you won't remember this, but John Tomasi, you and I were both on a program at Brown. And we were in the big auditorium at Brown, and it was on the topic of development economics. I can remember, and I gave a talk, in my typical talk about transition economies, and basically your version of the Bennett story. Look to the right, look to the left, like you're gonna grow up, kind of.
No empathy.
Yeah.
The EQ was not on display.
Yeah, no real empathy or whatever. Just like, this is the way it has to be. If you don't do it, you're going to screw it up, kind of thing. And I remember going to the end of the auditorium and you coming up and you giving a talk and thinking like, this is like the best teacher of like development economics I've ever heard. And like, if I was a kid in that room, like I would look at my talk and think like, well, I don't want to be like that jackass. But I look at you and I'm like, oh my God, like you can be a human being and be a development economist. Like, that's awesome. And so, there's a kind of I mean, and I'm not saying it's an art, because it really reflects you, but you were teaching in that environment. You're teaching with other disciplines. You're working with other colleagues. You're involved in that. You're working with really smart students that, care. And yet, in a lot of ways, that liberal arts experience is kind of where maybe the kind of ideas we care about thrive best, but as teachers, but at the same time is also the one that's under the biggest threat now. Right. So, and you're involved in all that. I wanted to ask you about your passion for teaching. Do you try to draw from Don in doing that? Or is that something that you're fueled all inside of yourself and your own experience? And
no, definitely, Dawn was a big part of that. It is that I want to do that moment of that realization. I stayed up all night. It in part was, and I want to do it as well as he does. And what he does so well, we've already talked about it, is that ability to say, why should we care about something like the policies of economic nationalism? Well, because it matters. It matters to humanity, right? And that's why it's important to understand sometimes difficult arguments in economics, is because it is the thing. If you care about the plight of human beings, you need to care about that kind of stuff. So that really was a model for starting from where the typical student is that, students care. The typical student cares a lot about the plight of the world. And so if you start there and you say, okay, we agree that this thing, the fact that people are kept from being able to succeed, have access to the basic requirements that allow for human flourishing, I care about that too, right? So start from the common ground and then say, and then how do we get there, right? Yeah. That approach was the only way you could teach effectively at a place like Beloit, because every Beloit student that came in was somebody who had a vision for the world becoming a better place, and typically they didn't walk in thinking that markets were going to be a part of that. And so my job was not to crush the optimism and idealism out of them. My job was to tap that optimism and idealism and help them to see how markets are part of that project, right? Or at least could be for them. And that was a much better training ground for me to teach than if there were a bunch of students who were already, say came from conservative households who liked the status quo of markets. I mean, I found, I would have been a sort of flaccid teacher if that had been my audience. The audience of Beloit students were exactly the kind of challenge I needed to say, okay, take their concerns seriously. And it's on you if you can't persuade them that they need to take markets seriously.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.